is Christy Smith from Comox First Nation, Gela Haisla. So happy to be here today and be your keynote. I wanted to acknowledge, of course, all the friends and to-be friends in the audience here. This is my first geoscience time ever, and I'm happy to be here on the 50th anniversary, which is really exciting. It's my first time in Whitehorse, first time in the Yukon, so super first for me. I'm excited, and obviously I'm coming back. It's been great so far. So I got bored over COVID and decided to write a book. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, but I'm also going to kind of talk about what some key components and some takeaways that I can share through that book. So one of the reasons that the book was written was my co-author Michael McPhee and myself really found that there was this sort of like two pieces of dialogue that we were having on a daily basis at work. He really supported regulators and proponents, and I was supporting the nations and trying to bring those conversations together. And we've been doing that for a long time. And really, we started to dissect some of the problems that we've seen over the last 25 years and some of the unique pieces and opportunities that we can see in the next 10, even 5 years, which is super exciting. I also sort of wrote this is a picture of my daughter. She's 15, and I shared a few stories at lunch. She's at home by herself. So this will be an interesting opportunity for her to showcase her responsibility. But really looking at leaving something that my kids could be proud of. And when I wrote the book, I went from my family is very, very strong storytellers. No one in my family has ever written anything. And so moved from a very oral base of what I normally do is talk, and for those that do know me, I don't stop, to a written form. And this was the most vulnerable thing that I think I've ever done in my life. Was to actually put stuff onto paper, especially because as an Indigenous person, you don't want people to say, oh, Indigenous people, this is what they say. So it was really had to be carefully constructed that it was my voice only and that maybe there's something somebody can get out of this. So anyways, we're gonna just talk a little bit about self-reflection, which is a part of the book. We're going to talk about educating yourself, and I really want to talk about the integration of Western science with Indigenous knowledge, which is my heart and passion. So self-reflection. Self-reflection is my first chapter, and number one thing that when I do workshops with other entities or other people, that we have a really strong conversation about how you enter a room, how you position yourself, how you show up for the day, even for yourself. I think it's really important as industry proponents, as people in general, that we come to the table open and ready to engage on an open and humble way, or in an open and humble way. And part of that is also acknowledging how to create safe spaces for dialogue, how to understand who you're going to actually be sitting with. So it's much different if I'm going to go sit down at the table with a bunch of friends, long history. I can just, shoot the shit. And it's a much different environment if I'm going into more of a boardroom where we're going to be beginning negotiations, or maybe just even introducing a project. And what we found, or what I find, is that a lot of people hold a lot of bias, assumptions, stereotypes, whatever you want to call it, internally as they're entering that forum when they're meeting people. And so really looking at how you leave that part at the door and how you come to a table in a good way. So know thyself is really what I'm saying. So I like this. One does not simply check their privilege. So we all have privilege. We all come to spaces with various realms of privilege. And what I mean by that is sometimes it's a privilege of knowledge. Sometimes it's wealth. Sometimes it's just seeing yourself as a better person or a better race. And so understanding what your privilege is and putting it aside and establishing relationships, like I said, in a good way. So I am an Indigenous woman. I work in a space and create safe spaces. But there are times where I forget to check myself at the door, and I hold like, oh, I know a bit more than like this topic than probably everybody in the room. I'm a human environment specialist, and forget to check. So one of the key fundamentals, if you can take anything away, is look at yourself and how you present yourself to whatever space you're going into. This could even be with your wife on a date, you know, those kind of things. The other piece in here, of course, is our unconscious bias, which is thinking you're sitting at a table with people that don't know what you're talking about. There is a lot of really strong Indigenous tables that know mining. I've seen companies completely fail to acknowledge that and basically get kicked out. My auntie is a very strong auntie from Comox First Nation, and she's the first to kick people out the door if like our own Indigenous knowledge isn't honored. So it comes out, and it can destroy a relationship really fast. The other thing too is a place of guilt. And the reason I raise this is that we've had a really hard last few years with all the stuff that's come out in respect to, and of course we knew, but respect to some of the news that has come out in the last 2 years. And I'm finding individuals are coming to the table with a bit of like, I want to help, and I'm doing this, and it really is coming from a place of guilt. I've had individuals say, well, I'm a white Catholic, and I don't know what to do, but I want to go in there and help out. And I'm like, all right, let's just talk about guilt, and how you need to engage and make this relationship with leaving that piece at the door. So it's a very complicated subject. I can talk about self-reflection and these elements for hours, but I will not bore you. But it is something that I wanted to bring up today because I think it's really fundamental on how everything is progressing in such an intertwined way that if we don't do this part, it's not going to be successful. And then, of course, educating yourself. So as I mentioned, a lot of times there's this pan-Indianism, this thought that, oh, I know this one area, so I must know what I'm going to do over here. Educating yourself about the nations that you're going into, super important, even to the point of understanding how they want to be engaged, how you want to build that relationship, and et cetera. The number one thing here is asking questions. Ask questions, educate yourself. So I'm just sharing this. This is sort of a cool little story, and like I said, I'm a storyteller, so it helps. Know your audience, and it's more than meets the eye. So these are fishing weirs. They dated back to about 8th century AD. They are completely around the estuary in the Comox region. So if anybody's been to Comox and you wonder what these stakes are in the estuary, we have about 300 plus weirs, but it equates to about 200,000 stakes. And these stakes have been completely sized at the same size for each of these weirs. We were responsible for certain weirs, and back before smallpox came in, there was about 12,000 of us, so we had a large amount of people to feed. What is neat about this, and what is it proves evidence to be, is that we have a high-functioning engineer process going on here. Same size of logs cut to the same height. We have sustainable forestry practices. So the logs that were chosen were specifically chosen like around the whole entire area. And we have a sustainable fishery practice, even to the point where we were actually supporting, I don't know what you want to call it, fish hatcheries, such elements. And so we would create this catch our food, for our families. But those elements are there. And the reason I bring that up is because sometimes it's remiss. Sometimes people are like, oh, that's so old and that's so cool. But that is cool. And if you think about it in today's day and today's engineering practices and what we can learn, is that we've had these skills for a very, very long time. So land, water, and 7 generations. So this is, and I actually don't have, the timer's not going down, so I have longer. I don't have a clock in front of me, so when it's time, just do the wave and I'll be quiet. So I really want to talk about this. So this is really at the forefront of the last little while for me and the work that I've been doing. So water for us and for all of us, super important. It makes us who we are. It's in our body. We are made up with, I don't know, was it like 95% water? A certain key element when we're looking at any project, it sustains all beings, sustains all of us. And then traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge, and I mean that can mean, and sometimes I don't like using the term traditional knowledge, but historical information that's been brought to the past or our indigenous way of knowing and being is super important to intertwine with Western science so that we have a really holistic way of managing the land, managing the water, and managing the ecology, and et cetera. So it is super important as we're progressing through projects to start incorporating some of these elements. So measuring what is meaningful. So in the system we have, and I'll use the environmental assessment process for an example. You know, you list your value components, you get an idea of, you know, what you're going to be looking at, what you're going to do for baseline. And I just had a project that, and it was rightly so, where an elder said, but we forgot a species of wildlife. And that species of wildlife hadn't been there for years and years and years, but the community said, oh, it'll be back. And so integrating those elements that are important for that community is super important to look at the habitat for that species that may not be there, but it could be there in 30 years. And we were looking at developing, you know, reclamation practices of what that site's going to look like for that species that may or may not come back, but the community has indicated that it would. So that is the integration. It's the measuring what's meaningful. It's looking backwards and bringing those elements forwards. So super important. So why is this important? I think I probably just rambled on about why for the last little while. But of course, we're sitting in a new era. We got the calls to action, UNDRIP. We've got a ton of court cases going through. The Yahi decision in BC, which talks about cumulative impacts. We've got a ton of other things that are in the works that are going to just transform on how we actually do business, and business on the land, and business with the integration of indigenous knowledge and Western science. The processes are requiring that intertwining of those two worlds now. So how's it been changing? We're starting to see different parts of the processes. I guess the environmental assessment process, obviously, for BC has totally changed. You guys have an amazing process here that intertwines those two worlds. And we're going to see things come out of the woodworks that have not been addressed before, but I guarantee you, 5 years ago, I could not have told you that I'd be standing here today talking about UNDRIP or talking about how things have changed. I was one of those people who went through my career thinking, do I actually have a long-term career in what I do? Well, that might have been 10 years ago, but because it just wasn't there. I didn't see evidence of how the processes and policies were going to change to allow for this conversation to be held today. So I'm very excited to be here speaking about it today, but I guarantee you in 5 years it's going to be a whole other discussion, which is super exciting. There is a need to look at the world in its entirety, the systems and the values in its entirety, and I think we don't do this well yet. This is one area that I think we will see the transformation come from. But a lot of times, and I'll use an example on another project, but a lot of times things are missed. Community-based indicators are not incorporated well into the assessment. Certain elements are missed. And so I think as we start to move forward, we're going to see more of that holistic framework, more of the world in its entirety. I can tell you, I met with an elder 2 weeks ago on another project, and she said, for 60 years, I've not seen the stars because of the lights of the mine. And I said, oh, that's a long time. And she goes, but there's 2 stories up there. And when I die, those stories don't move on. So if she doesn't get to see the stars above her land in 2 years, or sorry, not 2 years, but by the time she passes, she's going to lose those stories, which don't get passed to her grandchildren, which means a loss of culture and a loss of language for that element. Those are the things we've been missing. So there's a greater emphasis on sustainability, resilience, and looking to Indigenous knowledge for innovation. We can definitely see this as well, and I'm going to plug my women in mining a little bit, but the incorporation of women and Indigenous people into the mining sphere. Innovation comes from diverse thought. So super important. Weaving Indigenous knowledge in Western science allows us to measure impacts, and so this includes the whole world of socioeconomics, community baselines, and the integration of even design, engineering design, etc. So just really quickly, I'm a big fan of community-based indicators, so I will quickly talk about this, but essentially with community-based indicator work, and if it's led well with the Indigenous communities, you're going to get those values that are super important to be assessed within your environmental assessment. Where I'm seeing disconnect is if you have an environmental assessment that incorporates, Indigenous interest to a level, but doesn't do the full assessment. For example, the sky story that I told you, that doesn't look at, the 7 generational aspect. Like, you have to start thinking about planning a project in 7 generations, because our communities are going to be there for longer than that, but also it's a really good practice on how we can show that our industry is sustainable, like how that works. And there are sites that obviously have been around for a very, very long time. Okay, so what we've heard. So I'll just read a little bit of it because this is actually quoted. So indicators that measured impact on our cultures, this is actually an elder speaking, are always put in its own separate category rather than being integrated throughout. So there's this need and this draw to the communities want these values to be integrated when you're looking at a project. Culture and identity, social health, wellness indicators are closely integrated and related to wildlife, air, water, vegetation. They cannot be distinguished from each other. This is the other element. We assess everything in silos. We poorly assess things as a collective, as the entire world. Healing, generosity, reciprocity, or concept of stewardship are also integral to understanding what is meaningful for a community. So there's another element that is completely forgotten, and that is the generosity, the reciprocity, the stewardship elements. So there's a ton of things and a ton of work that we need to continually work within to integrate these values properly. So just a few respectful practices, because this is, I'm hoping you can take some things away. Of course, aligning with the nations or processes for data sharing. This is some of this information is super confidential. Some of it triggers emotions and trauma, and so really getting that information from the communities takes a long time, but it also takes a safe space and data sharing agreements, and could be formal data sharing agreements. Like I talked about before, creating a safe space for dialogue, understanding My girlfriend Michelle Nahaney from Nahaney Creatives, she does decolonization practices. She always uses the acronym WAIT, like why am I talking? So she's an advocate to say, like, look, by you talking can create a space that's dangerous, that's unsafe. So really looking at how to create a safe space for dialogue. Time is a colonial construct. Our time on projects is governed by the process, by the markets, by different things. Huge pressure on individuals raising finances. Totally understand it, but schedule has to be understood on a collaborative basis to make it work, because a schedule for a community isn't maybe or may not mesh with your own schedule. So keeping in mind that time is really important, and pressure on time can destroy a relationship. So if you look at 3 elements and you look at, schedule, budget, and relationship, you can have a relationship with collaborative time, but it'll impact your budget. You can have a high budget and a little bit more time, but your schedule goes out the window. But if you just are focused on budget and your schedule, your relationship is hooped. And why start? So really thinking on that paradigm, super important to recognize where you can give. So if you need to give a bit more budget to keep the relationship so that they have, maybe you can provide a bit more technical expertise to the community and save your schedule, fair enough. Or be lenient on your schedule and maybe a bit tighter on the budget. So those things need to be thought about as you're progressing through your projects. Owner control, access, possession principles. So strongly suggest understanding OCAP, processes and principles. And then validation of information. So this is a big area where I run into some issues, and I'm sure other people have as well, but really understanding that you're bringing forward the community's interest and not just the people that tend to show up to the community meetings on an ongoing basis. So there has to be a process of validation back to the community. And this is a bit tricky. I'll talk about my own community. We have about the same 10 people who show up to every community meeting and speaking on behalf of 350 of us. And that's a problem. So we've been trying to figure out ways to ensure that the path that the committees are taking the community have a process of validation. And it's unfortunate, it's just that some people have more time, some people are living off reserve, some people are raising their grandchildren. There's a ton of reasons why. But validation is super important when you're looking at integrating Indigenous interests. Again, I spoke about 7 generations. Impacts on the land are super personal. Impacts to the sky are super personal. They're felt deeply. This is a hard topic. Because we work in the resource sector, we impact the land. This is a point of nervousness. There's a lot of feelings attached to this. There's opportunities, which is great. So there's a mix of feelings that come about when we're talking about land. There's a difference in view. So 200 plus years versus short-term projects. Like I had mentioned, the Sky story, they were looking, that's a long-term, obviously a longer project, but relatively could be seen as short too, less than 7 generations. So how are we going to rectify, how are we going to deal with the loss of stories? Applying 7-generational thinking throughout the process, I think is really relevant. At least starting to think in that way, because we need the land for the future. Short-term projects work really well for employment opportunities. Creating, and I guess I'm going to segue a little bit, but when we're talking about short-term projects and projects that are maybe 20 years, highly suggest you look at 7-generational thinking in respect to what are you going to leave as a legacy. So if you're going to build capacity in the community, let's say they begin a company that'll support your project, can that project actually support more than your project? Because if not, it's 20 years and it's done. So how are you creating legacy with the decision making you're making with the communities that you're working within? So thinking that far out thought of how, how can you make a difference? What do you want to say to your grandchildren in like however many years, or we probably all have grandchildren, I do, but I mean, or your children's, and how do you want to be thought of like as a legacy person, somebody that created a legacy, or somebody that basically just got a project up and running for 20 years? That's a big question. And this can also gain support. So really and honestly, my timer is running now. This is an evolving practice. I really am empowered to sit in this space and feel good for the last maybe 10 years. So it is evolving, and as it's evolving more quickly. So we're seeing things change more quickly, but we're seeing a lot more pressure on the communities to actually participate as well. So we got to kind of manage that pressure to get to here. We need to learn from each other. I think we have a ton of different stories and a ton of different ways of how we've done business and good business. Doesn't always work for the next project, but maybe something out of the story or how a relationship moved certain pieces can support another, or a thought process, really important. Learning from Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge and Western science approaches. So the integration, how it's been integrated, in a respectful way, super important. We need to do this in what is measuring, what is meaningful, like I said on the slide, so it has to be meaningful. We got to do this with all intent, with our full thought process and our heart and soul into it. If you're just coming to tick a box, I don't think that's gonna work much anymore. I know there's a few players that are still ticking boxes, but I think it's the way of the past, and this is the way of the future. Scale of investment. You're starting to see a lot of focus on how companies and projects are doing things right. Super important. Realizing that these opportunities are done from a collaborative process and would not be possible with the direct involvement of the Indigenous communities. So we see that through our changes in processes and policies. And there's tons of recent examples of good things that have occurred and really powerful things that, and communities that have really been able to bring this to the next space. And I think I would love to, so part of my book, I've got some case studies in the back. I could write a book just since I stopped writing that book on even better case studies. So that's how fast we're moving. And getting this right is super important, creates opportunity. And if you get it right in the beginning, if you put everything in that thought process and how to check yourself at the door, the self-reflection, how you're gonna build this, the thought of 7 generations out, if you do all that front work and you work in collaboration with the nations, project success is it's evident, it's valuable, it's there. But if you don't, it's gonna cost money and hardship. And that is completely becoming evident with the case studies today. And that is all I have.